A patient ignored my explicit medical advice, my locum disappeared, and the prosecutor who was supposedly representing justice had already decided what my sentence would be before the hearing even started. In a moment, I'm going to walk you through every step of what happened. The surgery, the complications, the attorney who sold me out, and the moment I realized I'd walked straight into a trap. This is the Anthea Cohen case, and it's where everything started to unravel. For those who are new here, my name is Dr. Luke Gordon. I'm a plastic surgeon. I'm also a qualified attorney, and I spent 15 years being systematically persecuted by the South Africa Health Professions Council, the HPCSA. This channel documents our story with evidence, with documents, with recorded conversations, not opinions, evidence. If you haven't watched the Murray case series, you can click here, and I'll also link it in the description. But this case stands completely on its own, and in some ways even more infuriating, because in the Murray case, the system failed me through corruption and incompetence. But in this case, I was set up from the moment I walked into that hearing room. Let's start at the beginning. Around March 2006, a couple walked into my rooms for a consultation. I'll call her Anthea. That's not her real name, but she knows exactly who she is. She was a religious Jewish woman. She wore a sheitel, a wig required by Orthodox Jewish tradition. What I didn't fully appreciate at the time was that this wasn't just a religious observance, it was also concealing something. Total hair loss, permanent alopecia, caused by a lifetime of severe eczema and years of high-dose steroid treatment just to keep it under control. The wig was, so to say, doing double duty, and it was about to become the center of everything. She came in with a long list of procedures: a brow lift, a breast lift, and a tummy tuck. She'd been on high doses of prednisone, a powerful steroid, for years to manage her eczema. No active eczema signs were visible at the time. She appeared to be a reasonable candidate for surgery, but I was thorough. I spent a long time going through the risks and the recovery process. Now, for anyone with a modicum of common sense would appreciate this. Wigs sit directly on the scalp. They trap heat, sweat, and moisture. They create an ideal environment for microorganisms to thrive. Bacteria, fungi, everything. A neglected wig is essentially a breeding ground for bacteria. For a patient with compromised skin and a history of severe infection, wearing that wig post-operatively could be catastrophic. I want you to understand something. I wasn't giving vague post-operative instructions. I wasn't suggesting she might want to consider it. I was explicit, crystal clear. I sat across from her and told her directly, do not put that wig on your wounds. Not for any reason, not for any occasion. She nodded. She said she understood. She gave me her word. There was another issue. Anthea was in a hurry. She wanted that operation done within the week. This created a problem. My wife Annette and I had just planned a trip to Disneyland, to USA with our kids, a long-awaited family holiday. And the timing wasn't right. Well, the timing was tight. If any complications arose while I was abroad, a locum would need to manage the post-operative care or post-operative complications. So against my better judgment, I relented. I juggled the operating list to fit her in, and I arranged a locum to cover me for while I was away. She and her husband insisted that they were happy to proceed. I started with the brow lift first, And the moment I placed the scalpel on her skin and made the incision, I realized that I had a serious problem. Her long-term prednisone use had left her skin essentially paper thin. Stitching the wounds was extremely difficult. The operation took far longer than expected, but I managed to complete it without incident. When she came in the following day for her first post-operative visit, my nurse Sandy came into my office and clearly distressed. She said, "Dr. Gordon, Anthea is wearing her wig over her dressings." I was exasperated. I composed myself and went to look at the dressings. And it was only day one, but the dressings were still clean and in a most measured and patient way. In the most measured I could manage, I explained to her again directly, unambiguously, do not wear the wig while your wounds are healing. There is a real risk of severe wound infection. Once again, she agreed. Once again, she gave me her word. In the days following the surgery, while I was in the States with my family, Anthea developed a post-operative wound infection. And when she came in for dressings while I was 15,000 kilometers in Disneyland, she was wearing the wig again over her fresh surgical wounds, after she promised me she wouldn't, twice. Sandy immediately contacted my locum to arrange for Anthea to be seen. My locum had simply disappeared, missing in action. Nobody could reach him on his cell phone. I heard about the disaster while I was still in Disneyland, 2 days before we were due to return to South Africa. A friend of Annette's called her to say that Anthea had ended up in ICU with septicaemia. Was the infection caused by her ignoring my advice about the wig? I believe so. Could the outcome have been better managed if my locum had been available? Absolutely. And here's the thing. My locum was never held responsible for his negligence. At the end of the day, I was blamed for her complication. Was the outcome a result of surgical negligence? No. And the evidence supports that. But evidence, as I would learn over and over in years to come, becomes remarkably easy to ignore when someone has already decided what the outcome should be. A complaint was lodged with the HPCSA. I received the letter. The formal process began. My insurer appointed an attorney to represent me. I'll call her Olivia. She was a former vet who had moved into medical legal work. She came across as efficient, competent, organized. She was none of those things when it counted. As the hearing date approached, Olivia met with the HPCSA prosecutor, a man named Gershon Mosiane, for a pretrial conference. She came with a proposal. Mosiane, she said, was aggressive. He was threatening to have me struck off the roll of medical practitioners entirely. But he was offering a way out. If I pleaded guilty, the hearing would be a mere formality, a minor sanction. I'd be back in my practice the next morning. A plea bargain. I approached it. I said, the infection is a recognized complication. Infections happen. No surgeon would be practicing if every post-operative infection resulted in a HPCSA hearing and scrapping from the roll. Beside which, she had deliberately defied my post-operative instructions on multiple occasions. Olivia agreed the complication was manageable, but she said Mosiane was immovable. She had clearly been steamrolled by him. She was intimidated, and critically, she had not done enough independent research to know what I would only discover months later. There is no such thing as a plea bargain within the HPCSA. It does not exist in the Health Professions Act. Mosiane had dangled a fictional offer in front of my inexperienced attorney, and she swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker, and begrudgingly, against my better judgment, I agreed to the guilty plea. After all, she was the lawyer. On the day of the hearing, Olivia, her advocate, and I arrived and took our seats. The advocate barely said 2 words the entire day. I had the impression she had just come along for the fee. Then before the proceedings began, Mosiane walked over to the table and asked Olivia for a private word. She came back later, 10 minutes or so, and then she was ashen-faced. Mosiane, she said, had informed her that he was now aware of my previous conviction at the HPCSA, an earlier matter that I'll cover in a future video. The plea deal, she said, was off the table. Well, what do we do? I asked. This is not my game. Well, we've come too far to turn back, she said. Let's go ahead and take our chances. Let's go ahead with a guilty plea already entered, with an attorney and an advocate who had no idea of what they were doing, with no preparation for a contested hearing, with counsel who had no idea that the plea bargain she'd negotiated was legally impossible. Take our chances. Here's the thing. As I later learned when I completed my law degree, there was a correct path available to us. We should have immediately called all bets off and called for a postponement, regrouped, re-strategized, because I had an excellent defense. She had disregarded my explicit post-operative instructions and worn a wig on top of her wounds. I'd appointed a locum to cover for me while I was away, and he failed to be available to see her. And this was a recognized surgical complication. Nothing I did during the procedure constituted unprofessional conduct. Now, if you're a doctor watching this, here's a word of advice. Don't assume that because you have insurance, you have a guarantee of competent legal representation. As this case shows, I had 2 desperately inexperienced legal representatives who were intimidated by the prosecutor, who ultimately had another agenda. The committee deliberated, we waited. When they returned, the sentence was read out. 6 months of full-time rehabilitative training in an academic hospital, during which time I could not attend to my private practice, not for a single day. I was furious, and I had this sinking feeling in my stomach, the feeling of a man who's been completely set up. And then, immediately after the sentence was handed down, Mosiane walked over to us. His demeanor completely changed. Gone was the aggressive prosecutor who had spent weeks threatening to end my career with one previous conviction, a minor case. In his place was a man who was cheerful, relaxed, like someone who just finished the job he'd been hired to do. He looked at me and said, "Don't worry. There's no need to panic." At that moment, I didn't understand what those words meant. I thought they were empty reassurance, a prosecutor trying to seem human after a brutal result. They weren't. He was telling me something, and I was about to find out exactly what. After the hearing closed, I closed my practice. I had no choice. My income dropped to 0. Staff had to be paid. Overheads didn't stop. So I contacted my sister and told her the story. I'd completely lost faith in Olivia. Through my sister's daughter, I was connected with a senior attorney at Bowman Gilfillan in Johannesburg. Karina Bieler was her name, who'd had extensive experience in the medical legal field. The first thing she said when I walked into her office was, "Mosiane is a snake in the grass, renowned for his nefarious maneuvers." She filed an appeal. She started building a case. And then, 3 weeks later, the day after the appeal was lodged, something very strange happened. That's what I'm going to cover in part 2 of this video, and you can click on it because it's already up. You don't want to miss what comes next. And if you haven't already, the full story of the Anthea Cohen case, along with every other case that was weaponized against me, is documented in the Unbutchered memoir series. Book 1 is free on Amazon. The link is in the description. If you'd like to listen to the audiobook, click here. And I'll see you in part 2. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with anybody you may feel would be interested.